So, if you were watching service Sunday morning, you probably only got to see about half the message. In case you don't know what happened, everything just kind of fell apart on us all at once. We were, doing the live stream using the exact same system we use every Sunday morning to use the live stream. It's been pretty reliable so far, and I don't think it was our system that was the problem. I think the internet just got kind of overloaded since, it was a Sunday where a lot of churches started doing online only, and I think the whole system kind of got overtaxed. But regardless, halfway through the message, it just kind of quit. And so I busted out my iPhone and started going live on Facebook, even though we stream on YouTube, and tried to finish things up that way. We tried to reestablish the YouTube stream, but it didn't work. It just so Jake just looked at me and said, "Hey, just do it on your phone." And so I did. And a lot of people missed the entire second half of the message, which is a real bummer because I was really excited about this message. I've been excited about this whole series. And so what I want to do and what this video is um, my attempt to kind of make it easier for everybody to watch the message that wanted to see the whole thing. So this is Sunday's message, just in this environment instead of on stage. This is just something I felt like I needed to do to help people who are a little bit confused. We have a lot of people who are a little technology confused. I'm getting to the point where I get confused by a lot of it. This is to help you guys out there who wanted to. If you know somebody that missed service Sunday or couldn't make the jump from YouTube to Facebook, send them this video. Okay, this is going to be on the church's YouTube channel. But you can share it on Facebook or wherever else people watch. I'll be sure to post this on my page as well so that everybody has a chance to see the message in its entirety. That being said, let's get into this. So, one of my favorite movies of all time is The Flight of the Phoenix. And I'm not talking about the Dennis Quaid remake from 2004. I'm talking about the original one with Jimmy Stewart. Jimmy Stewart. It was an amazing movie. And if you've never seen it, there's going to be some spoiler alerts, but I'm pretty sure it was made in the 60s, so that's kind of on you at this point. Anyways, the movie it takes place during World War II over North Africa. And it's a story about two fighter pilot bomber crews. I'm sure like you military historians out there are going to be mad at me for butchering that, but they're two plane crews that are trying to shoot each other out of the sky, and eventually they do. They're trying to kill each other, and the next second they're trying to save each other. Like that's what happens. They crash land. This is the time before GPS or locator beacons or whatever else the military uses to find people nowadays. If you crashed in the middle of the Sahara Desert, it was understood by all these guys that it was going to be up to them to survive. And so, they crash land, and then 1 second, their biggest enemy is the guy in the other plane, and the next second, their biggest enemy is the Sahara Desert itself. And so they're kind of forced to have to work together to survive this thing. And so they're trying to get together a game plan, and eventually one of the Germans steps forward and says, "I'm a plane engineer. I design planes for a living. I think we can piece together both of our wreckages and make something that can get us out of the desert." And so everybody else is like, "Yes, this is a godsend. This is amazing. We've got like the perfect guy to do this. Let's make it happen." And so they go off of this guy's plan to build this kind of airplane thing to escape. Now, the day before they're going to fire up the engines and leave, one of the Americans asks the engineer, he says, "What kind of planes did you design?" And the engineer looks at him and says, "Well, I designed model airplanes, the little remote control kind." To which you can understand why everybody there was like extremely upset. They just realized that their entire survival plan was built around a guy who designs toys for a living. Like everybody kind of lost it at him. There was a huge fight, and eventually they decide we've got to just trust this. It's too late to turn back. Like they had rationed their water so that they could, survive. They stayed instead of trying to leave to find a place. They did things that they can't go back on now because they trusted this guy. And the guy makes the argument. He says, "Listen, a little airplane, a model airplane, a remote control airplane, it flies on the same principles as the full size airplanes. It runs off the same physics. It requires the same ratios of thrust and lift, and it's the same concept. It's just on a smaller scale." This week is week 3 of our series called Foundations. And this whole series has been built around the idea that the Old Testament needs organized. It's one of those things that Christians especially have trouble understanding. Number one, because we don't need to understand it to become a Christian. You know, the apostles were pretty clear on that at the Jerusalem Council that we read about in the book of Acts. You don't have to know the Old Testament to become a Christ follower. And that's a good thing. But on the other hand, there's a whole lot you're missing about your faith and about who Jesus was and about what he did without a proper understanding of the Old Testament, at least the events that happened, the big things. And so the whole point of this series is to help us organize the Old Testament in a way that we can understand it and grasp it and start to study it instead of just being this big, confusing mess of time and events and peoples. I mean, it's very different from us. It was written by a people to a people who we share almost nothing in common with other than we worship the one true God, Yahweh. And so that's the whole point of this series. And so we've been using the metaphor of a building, right? What Jesus did was he established the church. He built the church through what he did on the cross. But the church is sitting on the foundation of the Old Testament, and that foundation is sitting on the bedrock of Eden. And so every week we've kind of gone over this, and I'm going to go over it again because it's something that's really important that you grasp. Because if you understand what God did initially, you'll understand what he's going to do in the end, right? So God started with Eden, and Eden is creation as it is supposed to be and as it will be, right? When everything comes to an end and there's a new heaven and a new earth and they combine into one, and that's where, you know, God's people go for eternity. It has three elements, and those three elements were present only in Eden until the end. And okay, so the three elements are this. The first one is that God created a people for himself. They were his people. In Eden, everybody was God's people. Right? There was nobody that wasn't God's people. Everybody was God's people. He provided them a place. So we have a people, we have a place. You know, God provided Eden for his people to live in. And then he provided his presence. He wanted his people to be in his presence. And when Adam and Eve did their thing, they messed up, they sinned, all three of those things went away. And so everything God has been doing since has been in an effort to restore those three things. God wants to build a people for himself. He wants to build a place for them, and he wants to provide them with his presence. And so the rest of the series that we've been looking at has been how God has gone about rebuilding those things. And so the first cornerstone of the church is Noah, right? That's the first big event after Adam and Eve. God didn't really speak to Adam and Eve's descendants, really. Like they spoke to some of them here and there, but really on a humanity-wide scale, God didn't speak until Noah. And you know the story of Noah. And go back and watch all these videos. These sermons are online still. If you haven't seen any of them, I highly recommend you go for it. Go back and watch them. But Noah is where God starts to speak again. It's where he makes his first covenant with humanity, and he promises never to destroy everything in the way he did with the flood. But the really, really big significant thing there is that God started speaking again. And then we looked at Abram. Abram was a guy who God chose to establish his people through, right? God made a covenant with Abram and said, listen, your descendants are going to be my people. I'm going to make a great nation of them. I'm going to give them the land of Canaan for them to live in and to rule over, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. Which are the three elements of creation, right? They're just smaller. And that's called a typological covenant. And I said last week that if you didn't understand that whole typological concept yet, I'm going to talk about it every week. This week, you know, it's like that model airplane from the movie Flight of the Phoenix. It's a smaller, fully functioning version of a full-size airplane. It works the same. It has the same concepts. It uses the same principles. It's a fully functioning plane. It's just a smaller version. That's what these covenants are. They are fully functioning, but they're not the real thing. They're not the final thing. The final thing is the whole world is invited to be God's people if they accept Jesus as their Lord and Savior. And God's place that he'll provide for them is the new heaven and the new earth, and we'll always be in his presence. Like that's the end result. That's the full thing. These covenants before that are typological. They're types of those things. They're smaller, fully functioning, but not quite the full thing. All right, so we have Abraham, and that brings us to the third one, the third cornerstone of the church, and that is Moses. Now, before we get into Moses' story, we got to know the history, right? So Moses' story actually begins with Abraham. After Abraham made his covenants with God, he eventually had a son named Isaac, the promised child that God said he would have. And then Isaac had two boys, Jacob and Esau, and God chose to continue his promise to Abraham through Jacob. And Jacob has 12 sons, one of which his name is Joseph. If you ever seen the movie the Coat of Many Colors or the movie The Prince of Egypt, those are about Joseph's story, about how his brothers sell him into slavery. He gets taken to Egypt, which this is like the time when Egypt is arguably one of the most powerful countries on the planet, and he becomes prime minister. Now, every sermon, I like to make sure that we put a real time and a real place on the stories and the people that we're talking about because they really happened. One of the big fallacies of the Western church is we like to tell the stories in the Bible as if they're like fairy tales, and they're not. They're historical events. The Bible is a historical document. It's actually a collection of historical documents. And so it's important that we do our best to try to place these people and places in real history. Now, there's no consensus on when the story of Joseph happened, but my best guess, and again, I'm no expert on ancient Egypt, so take this with a grain of salt, is the Hyksos period of Egypt. Now, what the Hyksos period is it's a time when people from Canaan started moving to Egypt. These are Canaanite people, just like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. These are Canaanite people who live in modern day Palestine. Like that is where they lived. And they started moving to Egypt. These Hyksos kept multiplying, and eventually they had a large enough population that they could kind of take control of Egypt. They took control of northern Egypt, which Egypt gets confusing because northern Egypt is actually called Lower Egypt because the Nile River flows north. So it's weird. But basically, the Hyksos people, they did a lot of good for Egypt. Like they were the ones that brought the chariot to Egypt, something that Egypt's really known for because it was a huge game changer on the battlefield. And so these Hyksos people, they did a lot of good for Egypt. They ruled that northern section of Egypt, and then the native Egyptians ruled the lower section of Egypt, and below them was the Nubian people. And the Hyksos had good relations with all those kingdoms. They traded with the native Egyptians. They traded with the Nubians. Like they brought a lot of good to the nation of Egypt. But eventually, the native Egyptians they wanted their land back. And so these Canaanites, even though they had adopted Egyptian culture, they had adopted Egyptian religion, they still weren't Egyptians. And so the fact that they were Canaanites would make sense that Joseph would come along and it wouldn't be a big deal for him to become somebody really high up in the government because they're Canaanites too, right? But after the Hyksos period, when the Egyptians took back over, they launched this propaganda campaign to kind of run every Canaanite's name through the mud. Like in the Egyptian literature after this period, every time Canaanites are mentioned, they use racial slurs. Like they really made an effort to run every Canaanite people group through the mud. And so if you know Joseph's story, you know that his family eventually did move to Egypt too with him, and they settled in the land of Goshen, which was a really green land full of pastures and stuff like that. So it made sense for these shepherd peoples to settle there. And so after Joseph, his brothers and family, they multiplied. They had families themselves, and the people of these Canaanite descendants, they grew and they grew and they grew, and they had a big population base again. And so the native Egyptians who are now ruling Egypt, they said, we can't have that. We know what happens like when these Canaanite people build up their population. And so they enslaved all the Canaanite people groups that were living in Egypt. And they became slave labor force for them. And again, if you've seen the movie The Plagues of Egypt, you know what happens. Moses comes along, right? Now, Moses is born during a period when the Egyptians are trying to reduce this Canaanite population by having the firstborn sons or any sons born either smothered to death or thrown in the Nile River. Now, when I read that growing up, and I've read this story lots and lots of times, I just kind of skipped over that part, not because it bothered me, but because it was just like, yeah, that happens. Like, we think of the ancients as just being this brutal people that were okay with killing, but, these are real people. These people had true emotions. They had the same emotions we have. They're human beings. And, when I had two sons, this verse, this section, it really... It had a different meaning to me. And when we read that God says, he hears the cries of his people, these Canaanite people, these descendants of Abraham, and it breaks his heart and he wants to see them free. Well, that means a lot more to me now. You can understand that the cries of the people weren't just that they were upset that they were enslaved. Like they were losing their sons, they were losing their children for no reason other than propaganda and hatred. And so these Israelites, they needed somebody to lead them to freedom. And when Moses comes in the scene, his mother tried to save him by putting him in a basket and sending him down the Nile River. Again, if you've seen the movie The Prince of Egypt, you know what happens. He gets adopted by the daughter of Pharaoh, and he gets raised in the royal palace. He gets raised and educated with the best of the best, right? He's taught how to lead armies. He's taught how to have diplomatic relations. He's taught how to run state. He's taught how to govern. He's taught all these things that officials and higher wealthy levels of Egyptian society were taught. He was taught by the best of the best. And so Moses was arguably probably the only Hebrew who could have led the people of Egypt, right? Or the people of Israel, I'm sorry. He's probably the only one who was capable of that because he was the only one who was educated enough to do it successfully. Yeah, all things are possible with God, but it's also God sometimes will prepare us for the job that he has for us, uh, the rest of his Hebrew brothers and sisters, they were enslaved. They were uneducated. They were uncultured. They didn't know how to deal with royalty. They didn't know how to have these kind of state level leadership skills. They didn't know them. And so God chose to use Moses to lead the people out of Egypt. And again, if you see the movie The Prince of Egypt, you know what happens. He leads them out, across the Red Sea, the water splits, that kind of stuff. And eventually he leads the people to Mount Sinai. They're on their way to that land that God had promised Abraham called Canaan, where their ancestors actually lived. And on the way there, he stops at Mount Sinai and God meets with him and he gives him the law. Now, the law is something that if you read the New Testament, the part about Jesus and his apostles, you hear them talk about the law a lot. It was a big deal to those first century Jews. And by the way, we're talking about probably 1700 to 1500 BC for Moses' time, okay, or even a little bit later than that. Excuse me, but we're talking about a big separation of time, right? At least 1,000 years. But with Moses, that he gets the law, and it was a huge deal, and it was still a huge deal to the first century Jewish people in Jesus' day, right? The law is the first 5 books of the Bible, basically: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And Moses is the guy who wrote those down, with the exception of the last part of the book of Deuteronomy. How do we know that? Because that's the part where Moses dies, and we hear about how he dies and where he was buried and that kind of stuff. And if you're dead, you probably didn't write that stuff. So probably Joshua, the guy who took leadership after Moses, he's the one who probably wrote that down. That's our best guess, anyways. But anyways, Moses is the guy who wrote these down. And these were the law. These were the things that God wanted his people to know. And when God gave the law to the people, it did a couple really, really important things. Number one, it wrote down God's words, which it hadn't happened before in history. This was the first time we got to see God's, thoughts and what he likes and things about him, his characteristics. We got to see those written down for the first time. Before this, all knowledge about God was passed down by word of mouth. And so for things to be written down and codified and put in ink, it was a big deal. And the law itself, it did a couple things. Number one, it told the people of Israel how God wanted them to live. It told them how he wanted them to worship him through the temple. It told them how he wanted them to run their families, how he wanted them to run their businesses. And specifically, it told them how to run their country. See, that's the other big thing is this law, it made this amalgamation of Canaanite people, of some Egyptian people, of all these people that kind of left Egypt together. A lot of them were descendants of Abraham, but they were just this amalgamation of people, and they could have easily just dispersed and not been anything. But with the law, they became a nation. They became a people. And they were separated into tribes, and they were organized. And God said, here's how I want this nation to function as a government. And he created what we call a theocracy. Now, a theocracy is not like a normal government. There are a few theocracies out in the world today, and there have been throughout history, but they're rare because a theocracy says that a deity, a god, is the head of state. And so Israel's theocracy, it worked like this, right? Anytime you have really any government, you need the leadership to be able to speak to the people. You need the people to be able to speak to the leadership. And so God told the people of Israel to operate like this. He said, listen, I'm going to speak to the people through prophets, the guys who spoke God's word. That's what a prophet does, by the way. A prophet's not somebody that just sees the future. Like a prophet is just somebody who repeats a message God gave them. It can be about anything. So we had prophets who spoke for God. And then you needed a way for the people to speak to God, and that was what the priest's job were. They were the ones that brought the sacrifices to God. They were the one that prayed on behalf of the people. These priests were the people's voice to God. So you had the prophet speaking for God, you had the priest speaking for the people, and then you had a king. But a king wasn't like a normal king, right? The Israelites' king, his job was to kind of do the day-to-day administration of government. He wasn't truly the king. He wasn't really in charge. As a matter of fact, most of the time he was lower than the prophets, because the prophets were speaking for God. And we see that illustrated really clearly in what happens between the prophet Nathan and David after David sinned in his dealings with Bathsheba. A really famous Bible story where, he sees this woman, he wants to marry her, and so he has her husband killed off so he can marry her. Sinful thing. Shouldn't do that, right? And so the prophet Nathan, he comes and he confronts David about it in his courtroom in front of all of his officials. Now, if a prophet had done that in any other courtroom in the world, that prophet ain't leaving alive, right? You don't call out the king who has ultimate authority. You don't do that, period, because the king will kill you. But Nathan does it boldly because he knows that he is speaking for God. And David, even though he is king, he knows his authority comes from God and that his position and his life is dependent on how faithful he is. So you can see that the dynamics of a theocracy, especially Israel's, it's very different from a typical government. All right, and so that's the way God kind of functioned in the people of Israel. That's how he wanted this nation to work. And so the law, it created this nation. It showed the nation how God wanted them to live, and it created a covenant between them. And the covenant is one of these things that we got to make sure we understand who it was for and who it's not for, because of what the covenant does. All right, the covenant between God and the people of Israel is a conditional covenant. It says that if the people of Israel obey God's commands, and they worship only him, no other gods. They can't worship any deities. Can't be, multiple religions. They have to only worship God, and they have to keep his commands and the things that he told them to do. He'll bless them. He'll make them a great nation. He'll grow them. They'll be wealthy. They'll be respected by their neighbors. They'll have peace, right? But if they don't keep God's commands, if they don't only worship him, if they worship other gods, there are consequences. And the consequences are there to remind the people to get back to obeying God's commands and worshiping only him. Like, that's why the consequences are there. And if you want to read the full list of blessings and punishments or consequences, read Deuteronomy 28. That's actually one of the challenges for this week. Go read Deuteronomy 28 and see the consequences for doing bad and see the rewards for doing good. That's the way this Moses' covenant works. Do good, get good. Do bad, get bad. Thank God we aren't the people of Israel, right? Remember I said that it's important that we understand who this covenant was for. It's for specifically the people of Israel. That nation does not exist anymore. It ended in 586 BC. It's not on the planet anymore. This covenant is with nobody now. And it's important that we recognize that, because a lot of the problems with our faith and a lot of things that people get twisted on with the way God operates and God's character is they look at Old Testament things like this and they try to apply it to themselves when it wasn't intended for them. This covenant was not intended for God's people. Jesus fulfilled this covenant. We're no longer under it. We're under the new covenant. And the new covenant says it doesn't matter how bad you are. It doesn't matter how good you are. God's love doesn't change. That's what grace is. It's this idea that God's love doesn't change no matter what, that he cares about us and he loves us, and there's always forgiveness there for us. And, our response to that is loving him and loving others and serving others. That's what the new covenant is. This old covenant, this Mosaic covenant, it was for the people of Israel to solidify them and make them a people, because God had plans beyond just this nation. He had plans to expand his people from just this nation to the whole world. But to do that, he had to build a nation, and that requires boundaries, and that requires, establishing what he wants out of his people, what he wants them to live, how he wants them to live, how he wants them to act, how he wants them to interact. And if he doesn't set hard boundaries, they'll fade into oblivion, as we see throughout Israelite history. I mean, there's a reason that the nation of Israel doesn't exist anymore, because they couldn't keep the law. They couldn't keep this covenant. And eventually God called in the consequences of it and used other nations to disperse them. They were destroyed, and they were never brought back again. And as that people, the covenant ended. And so when we hear people say things like the pandemic is because God's angry with the world, or because God's mad at us, or we're so sinful, or because, we legislated this law or that law, it's not biblical. It's not a biblical thing to say. You know, the pandemic and every other natural disaster are just the results of the world being broken. And that happened at Adam and Eve. Natural disasters are not the result of people's sinfulness, the result of sin, period. And so it's important that we don't look at this pandemic as a moment when God's angry at us and he's just, he's trying to get us back to him. Like that's not how God operates anymore. He doesn't operate on a do bad, do good, get good operandus anymore. He operates on the message of grace. Like that is how God operates with humanity. He just wants us to come home, to accept Jesus as our Lord and Savior, and to be his people. And so I want you this week to stop and think about that. I want you to stop and think about how God interacts with us and how blessed we are that we don't live under the Mosaic covenant anymore. That we live in a time when God, he paid the punishment, the consequences that you would find in the Mosaic covenant for us through Jesus, right? That's the other big part of this you have to remember, is that God already paid the consequences, right? If you remember Abraham's covenant with God, where God's the one that passed between the slaughtered animals to say, like, this is what I'll be if I don't keep my covenant, except for in that covenant, he said, this is what I'll be if your people don't keep the covenant. And that's exactly what happened. God paid the consequences for not being faithful partners in this covenant. And so my challenge to you this week is, number one, to go read Deuteronomy 28. Go read all the consequences. Go read all the blessings. See why, and see if you can see that thread in there of God's hope. See if you can see that thread in there of God wanting to build a nation, to set boundaries, to help a nation grow and become his people. But the other thing I want you to do is count your blessings. This is Thanksgiving week, and we still have a lot of things to be thankful for despite the year 2020. Yes, we are in a time when we're back to virtual only at church, and that's a huge bummer. I mean, it really is. I do not want to be doing virtual church. I want to be doing church live and in person, and hugging and shaking hands and laughing and throwing our masks in a big pile and burning every single one of them. I'm tired of this. I'm fed up with it. But we walk the knife's edge of trying to protect people and keep people safe as best we can, and still being God's people together. And I don't mean to say that we're ever stop being God's people. We are the church. When we don't meet together, we're still meeting together. We're meeting together virtually, through phone calls, through text, through seeing people on the street and practicing, the social distancing or whatever. We're still the church. We're still God's people. We're still Jesus's body. But we just can't meet together safely right now. And despite that, it's an opportunity to bring the message of Jesus to a whole different people. To take this message somewhere that it hasn't been before. It's an opportunity to remember that we're not in control, and that we have to have faith like Abraham, that we have to trust even though we don't know all the details, or it seems like it's foolish to trust. We have to trust. But most of all, we have to pray. We have to be the people that pray for our leaders, for the decision makers in the world, that they will make the right decisions, that the doctors will find the right answers, and that at the end of the day, this whole pandemic thing causes people to see God clear. Not that God's trying to punish us into waking up and seeing him, but that God is asking us, his people, to be his hands and feet and to work through this disaster to show him to the world around us. And we'll show him to the world around us through love, through kindness, through patience, through caring, through a kind word, through a smile. Even if it's just your eyes because you can't see because of the mask. But it's being God's hands and feet to the people in a whole new way. We're living in a time that nobody else in history has really got to live through. Yes, there has been pandemics, and yes, there has been disease and stuff, but they didn't have the internet like we do. We have a new opportunity that nobody else has had. And so my challenge to you this week is to use that opportunity. Use the internet, use your cell phones, use text messaging, use the tools that you have available to be Jesus's hands and feet to the world around you. If you have any questions or prayer requests, please reach out to a staff member or a board member. If you have anything that you would like prayed about or have an urgent need, please use the One Call Now. You can contact me, Jake, or Larry Alexander, and we'll get that One Call Now prayer request put out there. We miss you guys. We wish you guys were here with us. But until that happens, we're praying for you guys, and we hope that you're praying for us. Until next week, we'll see you then.